Mr. Justice Harbottle by J.Sheridan Le Fanu and read by Christopher Halton. 30 years ago, an elderly man to whom I paid quarterly a small annuity charged on some property of mine came on the quarter day to receive it. He was a dry, sad, quiet man who had known better days and had always maintained an unexceptionable character. No better authority could be imagined for a ghost story. He told me one, though with a manifest reluctance. He was drawn into the narration by his choosing to explain what I should not have remarked, that he had called 2 days earlier than that week after the strict day of payment which he had usually allowed to elapse. His reason was a sudden determination to change his lodgings, and the consequent necessity of paying his rent a little before it was due. He lodged in a dark street in Westminster, in a spacious old house, very warm, being wainscoted from top to bottom, and furnished with no undue abundance of windows, and those fitted with thick sashes and small panes. This house was, as the bills upon the windows testified, offered to be sold or let, but no one seemed to care to look at it. A thin matron in rusty black silk, very taciturn, with large, steady, alarmed eyes that seemed to look in your face, to read what you might have seen in the dark rooms and passages through which you had passed, was in charge of it, with a solitary maid-of-all-work under her command. My poor friend had taken lodgings in this house on account of their extraordinary cheapness. He had occupied them for nearly a year without the slightest disturbance, and was the only tenant under rent in the house. He had 2 rooms, a sitting-room and a bedroom, with a closet opening from it, in which he kept his books and papers locked up. He had gone to his bed, having also locked the outer door. Unable to sleep, he had lighted a candle, and after having read for a time, had laid the book beside him. He heard the old clock at the stairhead strike 1, and very shortly after, to his alarm, he saw the closet door, which he thought he had locked, open stealthily, and a slight dark man, particularly sinister, and somewhere about 50, dressed in mourning of a very antique fashion, such a suit as we see in Hogarth, entered the room on tiptoe. He was followed by an elder man, stout and blotched with scurvy, and whose features, fixed as a corpse's, were stamped with dreadful force with a character of sensuality and villainy. This old man wore a flowered silk dressing-gown and ruffles, and he remarked a gold ring on his finger, and on his head a cap of velvet, such as, in the days of perukes, gentlemen wore in undress. This direful old man carried in his ringed and ruffled hand a coil of rope, and these 2 figures crossed the floor diagonally, passing the foot of his bed from the closet door at the farther end of the room, at the left near the window, to the door opening upon the lobby, close to the bed's head at his right. He did not attempt to describe his sensations as these figures passed so near him. He merely said that so far from sleeping in that room again, no consideration the world could offer would induce him so much as to enter it again alone, even in the daylight. He found both doors, that of the closet and that of the room opening upon the lobby, in the morning fast locked as he had left them before going to bed. In answer to a question of mine, he said that neither appeared the least conscious of his presence. They did not seem to glide, but walked as living men do, but without any sound, and he felt a vibration on the floor as they crossed it. He so obviously suffered from speaking about the apparitions that I asked him no more questions. There were in his description, however, certain coincidences so very singular as to induce me by that very post to write to a friend much my senior, then living in a remote part of England, for the information which I knew he could give me. He had himself more than once pointed out that old house to my attention, and told me, though very briefly, the strange story which I now asked him to give me in greater detail. His answer satisfied me, and the following pages convey its substance. "Your letter," he wrote, "tells me you desire some particulars about the closing years of the life of Mr. Justice Harbottle, one of the judges of the Court of Common Pleas. You refer, of course, to the extraordinary occurrences that made that period of his life long after a theme for winter tales and metaphysical speculation. I happen to know perhaps more than any other man living of those mysterious particulars. The old family mansion, when I revisited London more than 30 years ago, I examined for the last time. During the years that have passed since then, I hear that improvement, with its preliminary demolitions, has been doing wonders for the quarter of Westminster in which it stood. If I were quite certain that the house had been taken down, I should have no difficulty about naming the street in which it stood. As what I have to tell, however, is not likely to improve its letting value, and as I should not care to get into trouble, I prefer being silent on that particular point. How old the house was, I can't tell. People said it was built by Roger Harbottle, a Turkey merchant, in the reign of King James I. I am not a good opinion upon such questions, but having been in it, though in its forlorn and deserted state, I can tell you in a general way what it was like. It was built of dark red brick, and the door and windows were faced with stone that had turned yellow by time. It receded some feet from the line of the other houses in the street, and it had a florid and fanciful rail of iron about the broad steps that invited your ascent to the hall door, in which were fixed, under a file of lamps among scrolls and twisted leaves, two immense extinguishers, like the conical caps of fairies, into which in old times the footmen used to thrust their flambeaux, when their chairs or coaches had set down their great people, in the hall or at the steps as the case might be. That hall is panelled up to the ceiling, and has a large fireplace. 2 or 3 stately old rooms open from it at each side. The windows of these are tall, with many small panes. Passing through the arch at the back of the hall, you come upon the wide and heavy well staircase. There is a back staircase also. The mansion is large, and has not as much light by any means in proportion to its extent as modern houses enjoy. When I saw it, it had long been untenanted, and had the gloomy reputation beside of a haunted house. Cobwebs floated from the ceilings or spanned the corners of the cornices, and dust lay thick over everything. The windows were stained with the dust and rain of 50 years, and darkness had thus grown darker. When I made it my first visit, it was in company with my father when I was still a boy, in the year 1808. I was about 12 years old, and my imagination impressible, as it always is at that age. I looked about me with great awe. I was here in the very centre and scene of those occurrences which I had heard recounted at the fireside at home with so delightful a horror. My father was an old bachelor of nearly 60 when he married. He had, when a child, seen Judge Harbottle on the bench in his robes and wig a dozen times at least before his death, which took place in 1748, and his appearance made a powerful and unpleasant impression not only on his imagination, but upon his nerves. The judge was at that time a man of some 67 years. He had a great mulberry-coloured face, a big carbuncled nose, fierce eyes, and a grim and brutal mouth. My father, who was young at the time, thought it the most formidable face he had ever seen, for there were evidences of intellectual power in the formation and lines of the forehead. His voice was loud and harsh, and gave effect to the sarcasm which was his habitual weapon on the bench. This old gentleman had the reputation of being about the wickedest man in England. Even on the bench, he now and then showed his scorn of opinion. He had carried cases his own way, it was said, in spite of counsel, authorities, and even of juries, by a sort of cajolery, violence, and bamboozling that somehow confused and overpowered resistance. He had never actually committed himself. He was too cunning to do that. He had the character of being, however, a dangerous and unscrupulous judge, but his character did not trouble him. The associates he chose for his hours of relaxation cared as little as he did about it. One night during the session of 1746, this old judge went down in his chair to wait in one of the rooms of the House of Lords for the result of a division in which he and his order were interested. This over, he was about to return to his house close by in his chair, but the night had become so soft and fine that he changed his mind, sent it home empty, and with 2 footmen, each with a flambeau, set out on foot in preference. Gout had made him rather a slow pedestrian. It took him some time to get through the 2 or 3 streets he had to pass before reaching his house. In one of those narrow streets of tall houses, perfectly silent at that hour, he overtook, slowly as he was walking, a very singular-looking old gentleman. He had a bottle-green coat on with a cape to it and large stone buttons, a broad-leafed low-crowned hat from under which a big powdered wig escaped. He stooped very much and supported his bending knees with the aid of a crutch-handled cane, and so shuffled and tottered along painfully. "I ask your pardon, sir," said this old man in a very quavering voice, as the burly judge came up with him, and he extended his hand feebly towards his arm. Mr. Justice Harbottle saw that the man was by no means poorly dressed, and his manner that of a gentleman. The judge stopped short and said in his harsh, peremptory tones, "Well, sir, how can I serve you?" "Can you direct me to Judge Harbottle's house? I have some intelligence of the very last importance to communicate to him." "Can you tell it before witnesses?" asked the judge. "By no means, it must reach his ear only," quavered the old man earnestly. "If that be so, sir, you have only to accompany me a few steps farther to reach my house and obtain a private audience, for I am Judge Harbottle." With this invitation the infirm gentleman in the white wig complied very readily, and in another minute the stranger stood in what was then termed the front parlour of the judge's house, tête-à-tête with that shrewd and dangerous functionary. He had to sit down, being very much exhausted and unable for a little time to speak. And then he had a fit of coughing, and after that a fit of gasping, and thus 2 or 3 minutes passed, during which the judge dropped his roquelaure on an armchair and threw his cocked hat over that. The venerable pedestrian in the white wig quickly recovered his voice. With closed doors they remained together for some time. There were guests waiting in the drawing-rooms, and the sound of men's voices laughing, and then of a female voice singing to a harpsichord, were heard distinctly in the hall over the stairs, for old Judge Harbottle had arranged one of his dubious jollifications, such as might well make the hair of godly men's heads stand upright for that night. This old gentleman in the powdered white wig that rested on his stooped shoulders must have had something to say that interested the judge very much, for he would not have parted on easy terms with the 10 minutes and upwards which that conference filched from the sort of revelry in which he most delighted, and in which he was the roaring king, and in some sort the tyrant also of his company. The footman who showed the aged gentleman out observed that the judge's mulberry-coloured face, pimples and all, were bleached to a dingy yellow, and there was the abstraction of agitated thought in his manner as he bid the stranger good night. The servant saw that the conversation had been of serious import, and that the judge was frightened. Instead of stumping upstairs forthwith to his scandalous hilarities, his profane company, and his great china bowl of punch, the identical bowl from which a bygone Bishop of London, good easy man, had baptized this judge's grandfather, now clinking round the rim with silver ladles, and hung with scrolls of lemon peel. Instead, I say, of stumping and clambering up the great staircase to the cavern of his Circean enchantment, he stood with his big nose flattened against the window-pane, watching the progress of the feeble old man, who clung stiffly to the iron rail as he got down, step by step, to the pavement. The hall door had hardly closed when the old judge was in the hall bawling hasty orders, with such stimulating expletives as old colonels under excitement sometimes indulge in nowadays, with a stamp or two of his big foot, and a waving of his clenched fist in the air. He commanded the footman to overtake the old gentleman in the white wig, to offer him his protection on his way home, and in no case to show his face again without having ascertained where he lodged, and who he was, and all about him. "By sirrah, if you fail me in this, you doff my livery tonight." Forth bounced the stalwart footman with his heavy cane under his arm, and skipped down the steps, and looked up and down the street after the singular figure so easy to recognize. What were his adventures I shall not tell you just now. The old man, in the conference to which he had been admitted in that stately panelled room, had just told the judge a very strange story. He might be himself a conspirator, he might possibly be crazed, or possibly his whole story was straight and true. The aged gentleman in the bottle-green coat, in finding himself alone with Mr. Justice Harbottle, had become agitated. He said, There is perhaps, you are not aware, my lord, a prisoner in Shrewsbury jail, charged with having forged a bill of exchange for £120, and his name is Lewis Pinewick, a grocer of that town. Is there? Says the judge, who knew well that there was. Yes, my lord, says the old man. Then you had better say nothing to affect this case. If you do, by God, I'll commit you, for I'm to try it, says the judge, with his terrible look and tone. I am not going to do anything of the kind, my lord. Of him or his case I know nothing, and care nothing. But a fact has come to my knowledge, which it behoves you to well consider. And what may that fact be? Inquired the judge. I'm in haste, sir, and beg you will use dispatch. It has come to my knowledge, my lord, that a secret tribunal is in process of formation, the object of which is to take cognizance of the conduct of the judges, and first of your conduct, my lord. It is a wicked conspiracy. Who are of it? Demands the judge. I know not a single name as yet. I know, but the fact, my lord, it is most certainly true. I'll have you before the Privy Council, sir, says the judge. That is what I most desire, but not for a day or two, my lord. And why so? I have not as yet a single name, as I told your lordship, but I expect to have a list of the most forward men in it, and some other papers connected with the plot in 2 or 3 days. You said 1 or 2 just now. About that time, my lord. Is this a Jacobite plot? In the main, I think it is, my lord. Why then, it is political. I have tried no state prisoners, nor am like to try any such. How then doth it concern me? From what I can gather, my lord, there are those in it who desire private revenges upon certain judges. What do they call their cabal? The High Court of Appeal, my lord. Who are you, sir? What is your name? Hugh Peters, my lord. That should be a Whig name. It is, my lord. Where do you lodge, Mr. Peters? In Thames Street, my lord, over against the sign of the 3 Kings. 3 Kings? Take care one be not too many for you, Mr. Peters. How come you, an honest Whig as you say, to be privy to a Jacobite plot? Answer me that. My lord, a person in whom I take an interest, has been seduced to take a part in it, and being frightened at the unexpected wickedness of their plans, he is resolved to become an informer for the crown. He resolves like a wise man, sir. What does he say of the persons who are in the plot? Doth he know them? Only 2, my lord, but he will be introduced to the club in a few days, and he will then have a list and more exact information of their plans, and above all of their oaths, and their hours and places of meeting, with which he wishes to be acquainted before they can have any suspicions of his intentions. And being so informed, to whom, think you, my lord, had he best go then? To the King's Attorney General straight, but you say this concerns me, sir, in particular. How about this prisoner, Lewis Pinewick? Is he one of them? I can't tell, my lord, but for some reason it is thought your lordship will be well advised if you try him not. For if you do, it is feared 'twill shorten your days. So far as I can learn, Mr. Peters, this business smells pretty strong of blood and treason. The King's Attorney General will know how to deal with it. When shall I see you again, sir? If you give me leave, my lord, either before your lordship's court sits or after it rises tomorrow. I should like to come and tell your lordship what has passed. Do so, Mr. Peters, at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and see you play me no trick, sir, in this matter. If you do, by God, sir, I'll lay you by the heels. You need fear no trick from me, my lord. Had I not wished to serve you and acquit my own conscience, I never would have come all this way to talk with your lordship. I'm willing to believe you, Mr. Peters. I'm willing to believe you, sir. And upon this they parted. He has either painted his face, or he is consumedly sick, thought the old judge. The light had shone more effectually upon his features as he turned to leave the room with a low bow, and they looked, he fancied, unnaturally chalky. Damn him, said the judge ungraciously as he began to scale the stairs. He has half spoiled my supper. But if he had, no one but the judge himself perceived it, and the evidence was all as anyone might perceive the other way. In the meantime, the footman dispatched in pursuit of Mr. Peters speedily overtook that feeble gentleman, The old man stopped when he heard the sound of pursuing steps, but any alarms that may have crossed his mind seemed to disappear on his recognizing the livery. He very gratefully accepted the proffered assistance and placed his tremulous arm within the servant's for support. They had not gone far, however, when the old man stopped suddenly, saying, "Dear me, as I live, I have dropped it. You heard it fall. My eyes, I fear, won't serve me, and I'm unable to stoop low enough. But if you will look, you shall have half the find. It is a guinea. I carried it in my glove." The street was silent and deserted. The footman had hardly descended to what he termed his hunkers, and begun to search the pavement about the spot which the old man indicated, when Mr. Peters, who seemed very much exhausted, and breathed with difficulty, struck him a violent blow from above, over the back of the head with a heavy instrument, and then another, and leaving him bleeding and senseless in the gutter, ran like a lamplighter down a lane to the right, and was gone. When an hour later the watchman brought the man in livery home, still stupid and covered with blood, Judge Harbottle cursed his servant roundly, swore he was drunk, threatened him with an indictment for taking bribes to betray his master, and cheered him with a perspective of the broad street leading from the Old Bailey to Tyburn, the cart's tail, and the hangman's lash. Notwithstanding this demonstration, the judge was pleased. It was a disguised affidavit man or footpad, no doubt, who had been employed to frighten him. The trick had fallen through. A court of appeal, such as the false Hugh Peters had indicated, with assassination for its sanction, would be an uncomfortable institution for a hanging judge like the Honourable Justice Harbottle, that sarcastic and ferocious administrator of the Criminal Code of England, at that time a rather pharisaical, bloody and heinous system of justice, had reasons of his own for choosing to try that very Lewis Pinewick, on whose behalf this audacious trick was devised. Try him he would. No man living should take that morsel out of his mouth. Of Lewis Pinewick, of course, so far as the outer world could see, he knew nothing. He would try him after his fashion, without fear, favour or affection. But did he not remember a certain thin man, dressed in mourning, in whose house in Shrewsbury the judge's lodgings used to be, until a scandal of ill-treating his wife came suddenly to light? A grocer with a demure look, a soft step, and a lean face as dark as mahogany, with a nose sharp and long, standing ever so little awry, and a pair of dark steady brown eyes under thinly traced black brows. A man whose thin lips wore always a faint unpleasant smile. Had not that scoundrel an account to settle with the judge? Had he not been troublesome lately? And was not his name Lewis Pinewick, sometime grocer in Shrewsbury, and now prisoner in the jail of that town? The reader may take it, if he pleases, as a sign that Judge Harbottle was a good Christian, that he suffered nothing ever from remorse. That was undoubtedly true. He had, nevertheless, done this grocer, forger, what you will, some 5 or 6 years before, a grievous wrong. But it was not that, but a possible scandal and possible complications that troubled the learned judge now. Did he not, as a lawyer, know that to bring a man from his shop to the dock, the chances must be at least 99 out of 100 that he is guilty? A weak man like his learned brother Withershins was not a judge to keep the high road safe and make crime tremble. Old Judge Harbottle was the man to make the evil-disposed quiver, and to refresh the world with showers of wicked blood, and thus save the innocent to the refrain of the ancient saw he loved to quote, "Foolish pity ruins a city." In hanging that fellow he could not be wrong. The eye of a man accustomed to look upon the dock could not fail to read villain written sharp and clear in his plotting face. Of course he would try him, and no one else should. A saucy-looking woman, still handsome, in a mob cap gay with blue ribbons, in a sack of flowered silk, with lace and rings on, much too fine for the judge's housekeeper, which nevertheless she was, peeped into his study next morning, and, seeing the judge alone, stepped in. "Here's another letter from him, come by the post this morning. Can't you do nothing for him?" she said wheedlingly, with her arm over his neck, and her delicate finger and thumb fiddling with the lobe of his purple ear. "I'll try," said Judge Harbottle, not raising his eyes from the paper he was reading. "I knew you'd do what I asked you," she said. The judge clapped his gouty claw over his heart and made her an ironical bow. "What?" she asked. "Will you do?" "Hang him," said the judge with a chuckle. "You don't mean to. No, you don't, my little man," said she, surveying herself in a mirror on the wall. "I'm damned, but I think you're falling in love with your husband at last," said Judge Harbottle. "I'm blessed, but I think you're growing jealous of him," replied the lady with a laugh. "But no, he was always a bad one to me. I've done with him long ago." "And he with you, by George. When he took your fortune and your spoons and your earrings, he had all he wanted of you. He drove you from his house, and when he discovered you had made yourself comfortable and found a good situation, he'd have taken your guineas and your silver and your earrings over again, and then allowed you 6 years more to make a new harvest for his mill. You don't wish him good. If you say you do, you lie." She laughed a wicked, saucy laugh and gave the terrible Rhadamanthus a playful tap on the chops. "He wants me to send him money to fee a counsellor," she said, while her eyes wandered over the pictures on the wall and back again to the looking-glass, and certainly she did not look as if his jeopardy troubled her very much. "Confound his impudence, the scoundrel!" thundered the old judge, throwing himself back in his chair, as he used to do in furore on the bench, and the lines of his mouth looked brutal, and his eyes ready to leap from their sockets. "If you answer his letter from my house to please yourself, you'll write your next from somebody else's to please me. You understand, my pretty witch, I'll not be pestered. Come, no pouting, whimpering won't do. You don't care a brass farthing for the villain, body or soul. You came here but to make a row. You are one of Mother Carey's chickens, and where you come, the storm is up. Get you gone, baggage, get you gone," he repeated with a stamp, for a knock at the hall door made her instantaneous disappearance indispensable. I need hardly say that the venerable Hugh Peters did not appear again. The judge never mentioned him, but oddly enough, considering how he laughed to scorn the weak invention which he had blown into dust at the very first puff, his white-wig visitor and the conference in the dark front parlour were often in his memory. His shrewd eye told him that, allowing for change of tints and such disguises as the playhouse affords every night, the features of this false old man, who had turned out too hard for his tall footman, were identical with those of Lewis Pinewick. Judge Harbottle made his registrar call upon the Crown Solicitor and tell him that there was a man in town who bore a wonderful resemblance to a prisoner in Shrewsbury jail named Lewis Pinewick, and to make inquiry through the post forthwith whether anyone was personating Pinewick in prison, and whether he had thus or otherwise made his escape. The prisoner was safe, however, and no question as to his identity. In due time, Judge Harbottle went circuit, and in due time the judges were in Shrewsbury. News travelled slowly in those days, and newspapers, like the wagons and stagecoaches, took matters easily. Mrs. Pinewick, in the judge's house, with a diminished household, the greater part of the judge's servants having gone with him, for he had given up riding circuit and travelled in his coach in state, kept house rather solitarily at home. In spite of quarrels, in spite of mutual injuries, some of them inflicted by herself, enormous, in spite of a married life of spited bickerings, a life in which there seemed no love or liking or forbearance, for years, now that Pinewick stood in near danger of death, something like remorse came suddenly upon her. She knew that in Shrewsbury were transacting the scenes which were to determine his fate. She knew she did not love him, but she could not have supposed even a fortnight before that the hour of suspense could have affected her so powerfully. She knew the day on which the trial was expected to take place. She could not get it out of her head for a minute. She felt faint as it drew towards evening. 2 or 3 days passed, and then she knew that the trial must be over by this time. There were floods between London and Shrewsbury, and news was long delayed. She wished the floods would last forever. It was dreadful waiting to hear, dreadful to know that the event was over, and that she could not hear till self-willed rivers subsided, dreadful to know that they must subside and the news come at last. She had some vague trust in the judge's good nature, and much in the resources of chance and accident. She had contrived to send the money he wanted. He would not be without legal advice and energetic and skilled support. At last the news did come, a long arrear all in a gush, a letter from a female friend in Shrewsbury, a return of the sentences sent up for the judge, and most important because most easily got at, being told with great aplomb and brevity, the long-deferred intelligence of the Shrewsbury Assizes in the Morning Advertiser. Like an impatient reader of a novel who reads the last page first, she read with dizzy eyes the list of the executions. 2 were respited, 7 were hanged, and in that capital catalogue was this line, Lewis Pinewick, forgery. She had to read it 6 times over before she was sure she understood it. Here was the paragraph. Sentence death, 7. Executed accordingly on Friday the 13th instant, to wit, Thomas Primer, alias Duck, highway robbery, Flora Guy. Stealing to the value of 11 shillings and sixpence. Arthur Pounden, burglary, Matilda Mummery, riot, Lewis Pinewick, forgery, bill of exchange. And when she reached this, she read it over and over, feeling very cold and sick. This buxom housekeeper was known in the house as Mrs. Carwell, Carwell being her maiden name, which she had resumed. No one in the house except its master knew her history. Her introduction had been managed craftily. No one suspected that it had been concerted between her and the old reprobate in scarlet and ermine. Flora Carwell ran up the stairs now, and snatched her little girl, hardly 7 years of age, whom she met on the lobby, hurriedly up in her arms, and carried her into her bedroom, without well knowing what she was doing, and sat down, placing the child before her. She was not able to speak. She held the child before her, and looked in the little girl's wondering face, and burst into tears of horror. She thought the judge could have saved him. I dare say he could. For a time she was furious with him, and hugged and kissed her bewildered little girl, who returned her gaze with large round eyes. That little girl had lost her father and knew nothing of the matter. She had always been told that her father was dead long ago. A woman, coarse, uneducated, vain and violent, does not reason or even feel very distinctly, but in these tears of consternation were mingling a self-upbraiding. She felt afraid of that little child. But Mrs. Carwell was a person who lived not upon sentiment but upon beef and pudding. She consoled herself with punch. She did not trouble herself long even with resentments. She was a gross and material person, and could not mourn over the irrevocable for more than a limited number of hours, even if she would. Judge Harbottle was soon in London again. Except the gout, this savage old Epicurean never knew a day's sickness. He laughed and coaxed and bullied away the young woman's faint upbraidings, and in a little time Lewis Pinewick troubled her no more, and the judge secretly chuckled over the perfectly fair removal of a bore, who might have grown little by little into something very like a tyrant. It was the lot of the judge, whose adventures I am now recounting, to try criminal cases at the Old Bailey shortly after his return. He had commenced his charge to the jury in a case of forgery, and was, after his wont, thundering dead against the prisoner, with many a hard aggravation and cynical jibe, when suddenly all died away in silence, and instead of looking at the jury, the eloquent judge was gaping at some person in the body of the court. Among the persons of small importance who stand and listen at the sides was one tall enough to show with a little prominence, a slight mean figure dressed in seedy black, lean and dark of visage. He had just handed a letter to the crier before he caught the judge's eye. The judge described to his amazement the features of Lewis Pinewick. He had the usual faint thin-lipped smile, and with his blue chin raised in air, and as it seemed quite unconscious of the distinguished notice he has attracted, he was stretching his low cravat with his crooked fingers, while he slowly turned his head from side to side, a process which enabled the judge to see distinctly a stripe of swollen blue round his neck, which indicated, he thought, the grip of the rope. This man, with a few others, had got a footing on a step from which he could better see the court. He now stepped down, and the judge lost sight of him. His lordship signed energetically with his hand in the direction in which this man had vanished. He turned to the tipstaff. His first effort to speak ended in a gasp. He cleared his throat and told the astounded official to arrest that man who had interrupted the court. "He's but this moment gone down there. Bring him in custody before me within 10 minutes' time, or I'll strip your gown from your shoulders and fine the sheriff," he thundered, while his eyes flashed round the court in search of the functionary. Attorneys, counsellors, idle spectators gazed in the direction in which Mr. Justice Harbottle had shaken his gnarled old hand. They compared notes. Not one had seen anyone making a disturbance. They asked one another if the judge was losing his head. Nothing came of the search. His lordship concluded his charge a great deal more tamely, and when the jury retired, he stared round the court with a wandering mind, and looked as if he would not have given sixpence to see the prisoner hanged. The judge had received the letter. Had he known from whom it came, he would no doubt have read it instantaneously. As it was, he simply read the direction, "To the Honourable the Lord Justice Elijah Harbottle, one of His Majesty's Justices of the Honourable Court of Common Pleas." It remained forgotten in his pocket till he reached home. When he pulled out that and others from the capacious pocket of his coat, it had its turn as he sat in his library in his thick silk dressing-gown, and then he found its contents to be a closely written letter in a clerk's hand and an enclosure in secretary hand, as I believe the angular scrivenery of law writings in those days was termed, engrossed on a bit of parchment about the size of this page. The letter said, "Mr. Justice Harbottle, my lord, I am ordered by the High Court of Appeal to acquaint your lordship, in order to your better preparing yourself for your trial, that a true bill hath been sent down, and the indictment lieth against your lordship for the murder of one Lewis Pinewick of Shrewsbury, a citizen wrongfully executed for the forgery of a bill of exchange on the blank day of blank last, by reason of the wilful perversion of the evidence, and the undue pressure put upon the jury, together with the illegal admission of evidence by your lordship, well knowing the same to be illegal, by all which the promoter of the prosecution of the said indictment before the High Court of Appeal hath lost his life. And the trial of the said indictment, I am farther ordered to acquaint your lordship, is fixed for the both day of blank next ensuing, by the Right Honourable the Lord Chief Justice Twofold of the court aforesaid, to wit, the High Court of Appeal, on which day it will most certainly take place. And I am farther to acquaint your lordship, to prevent any surprise or miscarriage, that your case stands first for the said day, and that the said High Court of Appeal sits day and night, and never rises. And herewith, by order of the said court, I furnish your lordship with a copy extract of the record in this case, except of the indictment, whereof notwithstanding the substance and effect is supplied to your lordship in this notice. And farther I am to inform you that in case the jury then to try your lordship should find you guilty, the Right Honourable the Lord Chief Justice will, in passing sentence of death upon you, fix the day of execution for the 10th day of blank, being 1 calendar month from the day of your trial. It was signed by Caleb Searcher, officer of the Crown Solicitor in the Kingdom of Life and Death. The judge glanced through the parchment. "Splud! Do they think a man like me is to be bamboozled by their buffoonery?" The judge's coarse features were wrung into one of his sneers, but he was pale. Possibly, after all, there was a conspiracy on foot. It was queer. Did they mean to pistol him in his carriage, or did they only aim at frightening him? Judge Harbottle had more than enough of animal courage. He was not afraid of highwaymen, and he had fought more than his share of duels, being a foul-mouthed advocate while he held briefs at the bar. No one questioned his fighting qualities, but with respect to this particular case of Pinewick, he lived in a house of glass. Was there not his pretty, dark-eyed, overdressed housekeeper, Mrs. Flora Carwell? Very easy for people who knew Shrewsbury to identify Mrs. Pinewick if once put upon the scent. And had he not stormed and worked hard in that case? Had he not made it hard sailing for the prisoner? Did he not know very well what the bar thought of it? It would be the worst scandal that ever blasted judge. So much there was intimidating in the matter, but nothing more. The judge was a little bit gloomy for a day or two after, and more testy with everyone than usual. He locked up the papers, and about a week after he asked his housekeeper one day in the library, "Had your husband never a brother?" Mrs. Carwell squalled on this sudden introduction of the funereal topic and cried exemplary piggins full, as the judge used pleasantly to say. But he was in no mood for trifling now, and he said sternly, "Come, madam, this wearies me. Do it another time and give me an answer to my question." So she did. Pinewick had no brother living. He once had one, but he died in Jamaica. "How do you know he is dead?" asked the judge. "Because he told me so. Not the dead man. Pinewick told me so. Is that all?" sneered the judge. He pondered this matter, and time went on. The judge was growing a little morose and less enjoying. The subject struck nearer to his thoughts than he fancied it could have done. But so it is with most undivulged vexations, and there was no one to whom he could tell this one. It was now the 9th, and Mr. Justice Harbottle was glad. He knew nothing would come of it. Still it bothered him, and tomorrow would see it well over. What of the paper I have cited? No one saw it during his life, no one after his death. He spoke of it to Dr. Headstone, and what purported to be a copy in the old judge's handwriting was found. The original was nowhere. Was it a copy of an illusion? Incident to brain disease? Such is my belief. Judge Harbottle went this night to the play at Drury Lane. He was one of the old fellows who care nothing for late hours and occasional knocking about in pursuit of pleasure. He had appointed with 2 cronies of Lincoln's Inn to come home in his coach with him to sup after the play. They were not in his box, but were to meet him near the entrance and get into his carriage there, and Mr. Justice Harbottle, who hated waiting, was looking a little impatiently from the window. The judge yawned. He told the footman to watch for Councillor Thavies and Councillor Bella, who were coming, and with another yawn he laid his cocked hat on his knees, closed his eyes, leaned back in his corner, wrapped his mantle closer about him, and began to think of pretty Mrs. Abington. And being a man who could sleep like a sailor at a moment's notice, he was thinking of taking a nap. Those fellows had no business to keep a judge waiting. He heard their voices now. Those rake-hell councillors were laughing and bantering and sparring after their wont. The carriage swayed and jerked as one got in, and then again as the other followed. The door clapped, and the coach was now jogging and rumbling over the pavement. The judge was a little bit sulky. He did not care to sit up and open his eyes. Let them suppose he was asleep. He heard them laugh with more malice than good humour, he thought, as they observed it. He would give them a damned hard knock or two when they got to his door, and till then he would counterfeit his nap. The clocks were chiming 12. Bella and Thavies were silent as tombstones. They were generally loquacious and merry rascals. The judge suddenly felt himself roughly seized and thrust from his corner into the middle of the seat, and opening his eyes, instantly he found himself between his 2 companions. Before he could blurt out the oath that was at his lips, he saw that they were 2 strangers, evil-looking fellows, each with a pistol in his hand, and dressed like Bow Street officers. The judge clutched at the check-string. The coach pulled up. He stared about him. They were not among houses, but through the windows, under a broad moonlight, he saw a black moor stretching lifelessly from right to left with rotting trees, pointing fantastic branches in the air, standing here and there in groups, as if they held up their arms and twigs like fingers, in horrible glee at the judge's coming. A footman came to the window. He knew his long face and sunken eyes. He knew it was Dingley Chuff 15 years ago, a footman in his service, whom he had turned off at a moment's notice, in a burst of jealousy, and indicted for a missing spoon. The man had died in prison of the jail fever. The judge drew back in utter amazement. His armed companions signed mutely, and they were again gliding over this unknown moor. The bloated and gouty old man, in his horror, considered the question of resistance, but his athletic days were long over. This moor was a desert, there was no help to be had. He was in the hands of strange servants, even if his recognition turned out to be a delusion, and they were under the command of his captors. There was nothing for it but submission for the present. Suddenly the coach was brought nearly to a standstill, so that the prisoner saw an ominous sight from the window. It was a gigantic gallows beside the road. It stood three-sided, and from each of its three broad beams at top depended in chains some 8 or 10 bodies, from several of which the cereclothes had dropped away, leaving the skeletons swinging lightly by their chains. A tall ladder reached to the summit of the structure, and on the peat beneath lay bones. On top of the dark transverse beam facing the road, from which, as from the other two completing the triangle of death, dangled a row of these unfortunates in chains, a hangman with a pipe in his mouth, much as we see him in the famous print of The Idle Apprentice, though here his perch was ever so much higher, was reclining at his ease and listlessly shying bones, from a little heap at his elbow, at the skeletons that hung round, bringing down now a rib or two, now a hand, now half a leg. A long-sighted man could have discerned that he was a dark fellow, lean, and from continually looking down on the earth from the elevation over which, in another sense, he always hung, his nose, his lips, his chin, were pendulous and loose, and drawn down into a monstrous grotesque. This fellow took his pipe from his mouth on seeing the coach, stood up and cut some solemn capers high on his beam, and shook a new rope in the air, crying with a voice high and distant as the caw of a raven hovering over a gibbet, "A robe for Judge Harbottle." The coach was now driving on at its old swift pace. So high a gallows as that the judge had never, even in his most hilarious moments, dreamed of. He thought he must be raving. And the dead footman! He shook his ears and strained his eyelids. But if he was dreaming, he was unable to awake himself. There was no good in threatening these scoundrels. A brutum fulmen might bring a real one on his head. Any submission to get out of their hands, and then heaven and earth he would move to unearth and hunt them down. Suddenly they drove round a corner of a vast white building and under a porte-cochere. The judge found himself in a corridor lighted with dingy oil lamps, the walls of bare stone. It looked like a passage in a prison. His guards placed him in the hands of other people. Here and there he saw bony and gigantic soldiers passing to and fro, with muskets over their shoulders. They looked straight before them, grinding their teeth in bleak fury, with no noise but the clank of their shoes. He saw these by glimpses, round corners and at the ends of passages, but he did not actually pass them by. And now, passing under a narrow doorway, he found himself in the dock, confronting a judge in his scarlet robes, in a large courthouse. There was nothing to elevate this temple of Themis above its vulgar kind elsewhere. Dingy enough it looked, in spite of candles lighted in decent abundance. A case had just closed, and the last juror's back was seen escaping through the door in the wall of the jury box. There were some dozen barristers, some fiddling with pen and ink, others buried in briefs, some beckoning with the plumes of their pens to their attorneys, of whom there were no lack. There were clerks toing and froing, and the officers of the court, and the registrar, who was handing up a paper to the judge, and the tipstaff, who was presenting a note at the end of his wand to a king's counsel over the heads of the crowd between. If this was the High Court of Appeal, which never rose day or night, it might account for the pale and jaded aspect of everybody in it. An air of indescribable gloom hung upon the pallid features of all the people here. No one ever smiled. All looked more or less secretly suffering. "The king against Elijah Harbottle," shouted the officer. "Is the appellant Lewis Pinewick in court?" asked Chief Justice Twofold, in a voice of thunder that shook the woodwork of the court and boomed down the corridors. Up stood Pinewick from his place at the table. "Arraign the prisoner!" roared the chief, and Judge Harbottle felt the panels of the dock round him, and the floor, and the rails quiver in the vibrations of that tremendous voice. The prisoner in limine objected to this pretended court as being a sham and non-existent in point of law, and then that even if it were a court constituted by law, the judge was growing dazed, it had not and could not have any jurisdiction to try him for his conduct on the bench. Whereupon the Chief Justice laughed suddenly, and everyone in court, turning round upon the prisoner, laughed also, till the laugh grew and roared all round like a deafening acclamation. He saw nothing but glittering eyes and teeth, a universal stare and grin. But though all the voices laughed, not a single face of all those that concentrated their gaze upon him looked like a laughing face. The mirth subsided as suddenly as it began. The indictment was read. Judge Harbottle actually pleaded. He pleaded not guilty. A jury was sworn. The trial proceeded. Judge Harbottle was bewildered. This could not be real. He must be either mad or going mad, he thought. One thing could not fail to strike even him. This Chief Justice Twofold, who was knocking him about at every turn with sneer and jibe, and roaring him down with his tremendous voice, was a dilated effigy of himself, an image of Mr. Justice Harbottle, at least double his size, and with all his fierce colouring and his ferocity of eye and visage enhanced awfully. Nothing the prisoner could argue, cite or state was permitted to retard for a moment the march of the case towards its catastrophe. The Chief Justice seemed to feel his power over the jury and to exult and riot in the display of it. He glared at them, he nodded to them, he seemed to have established an understanding with them. The lights were faint in that part of the court. The jurors were mere shadows sitting in rows. The prisoner could see a dozen pair of white eyes shining coldly out of the darkness, and whenever the judge in his charge, which was contemptuously brief, nodded and grinned and jibed, the prisoner could see in the obscurity by the dip of all these rows of eyes together that the jury nodded in acquiescence. And now the charge was over. The huge Chief Justice leaned back panting and gloating on the prisoner. Everyone in the court turned about and gazed with steadfast hatred on the man in the dock. From the jury box, where the 12 sworn brethren were whispering together, a sound in the general stillness like a prolonged hiss was heard, and then, in answer to the challenge of the officer, "How say you, gentlemen of the jury, guilty or not guilty?" came in a melancholy voice, the finding guilty. The place seemed to the eyes of the prisoner to grow gradually darker and darker, till he could discern nothing distinctly but the lumen of the eyes that were turned upon him from every bench and side and corner and gallery of the building. The prisoner doubtless thought that he had quite enough to say, and conclusive, why sentence of death should not be pronounced upon him. But the Lord Chief Justice puffed it contemptuously away, like so much smoke, and proceeded to pass sentence of death upon the prisoner, having named the 10th of the ensuing month for his execution. Before he had recovered the stun of this ominous farce, in obedience to the mandate, remove the prisoner, he was led from the dock. The lamps seemed all to have gone out, and there were stoves and charcoal fires here and there that threw a faint crimson light on the walls of the corridors through which he passed. The stones that composed them looked now enormous, cracked and unhewn. He came into a vaulted smithy where 2 men, naked to the waist, with heads like bulls, round shoulders, and the arms of giants, were welding red-hot chains together with hammers that pelted like thunderbolts. They looked on the prisoner with fierce red eyes, and rested on their hammers for a minute, and said the elder to his companion, "Take out Elijah Harbottle's gyves," and with the pincers he plucked the end which lay dazzling in the fire from the furnace. "One end locks," said he, taking the cool end of the iron in one hand, while with the grip of a vice he seized the leg of the judge and locked the ring round his ankle. "The other," he said with a grin, "is welded." The iron band that was to form the ring for the other leg lay still red-hot upon the stone floor, with brilliant sparks sporting up and down its surface. His companion, in his gigantic hands, seized the old judge's other leg and pressed his foot immovably to the stone floor, while his senior, in a twinkling, with a masterly application of pincers and hammer, sped the glowing bar around his ankle so tight that the skin and sinews smoked and bubbled again, and old Judge Harbottle uttered a yell that seemed to chill the very stones and make the iron chains quiver on the wall. Chains, vaults, smiths and smithy all vanished in a moment, but the pain continued. Mr. Justice Harbottle was suffering torture all round the ankle on which the infernal smiths had just been operating. His friends, Thavies and Bella, were startled by the judge's roar in the midst of their elegant trifling about a marriage a la mode case which was going on. The judge was in panic as well as pain. The street lamps and the light of his own hall door restored him. "I'm very bad," growled he between his set teeth. "My foot's blazing. Who was he that hurt my foot? 'Tis the gout, 'tis the gout," he said, awaking completely. "How many hours have we been coming from the playhouse? Splud, what has happened on the way? I've slept half the night." There had been no hitch or delay, and they had driven home at a good pace. The judge, however, was in gout. He was feverish too, and the attack, though very short, was sharp. And when, in about a fortnight, it subsided, his ferocious joviality did not return. He could not get this dream, as he chose to call it, out of his head. People remarked that the judge was in the vapours. His doctor said he should go for a fortnight to Buxton. Whenever the judge fell into a brown study, he was always conning over the terms of the sentence pronounced upon him in his vision, "in 1 calendar month from the date of this day," and then the usual form, "and you shall be hanged by the neck till you are dead," etc. That will be the 10th. I'm not much in the way of being hanged. I know what stuff dreams are, and I laugh at them, but this is continually in my thoughts, as if it forecasts misfortune of some sort. I wish the day my dream gave me were past and over. I wish I were well purged of my gout. I wish I were as I used to be. 'Tis nothing but vapours, nothing but a maggot. The copy of the parchment and letter which had announced his trial with many a snort and sneer he would read over and over again, and the scenery and people of his dream would rise about him in places the most unlikely, and steal him in a moment from all that surrounded him into a world of shadows. The judge had lost his iron energy and banter. He was growing taciturn and morose. The bar remarked the change as well they might. His friends thought him ill. The doctor said he was troubled with hypochondria, and that his gout was still lurking in his system, and ordered him to that ancient haunt of crutches and chalkstones, Buxton. The judge's spirits were very low. He was frightened about himself, and he described to his housekeeper having sent for her to his study to drink a dish of tea, his strange dream in his drive home from Drury Lane Playhouse. He was sinking into the state of nervous dejection in which men lose their faith in orthodox advice, and in despair consult quacks, astrologers, and nursery storytellers. Could such a dream mean that he was to have a fit, and so die on the both? She did not think so. On the contrary, it was certain some good luck must happen on that day. The judge kindled, and for the first time for many days he looked for a minute or two like himself, and he tapped her on the cheek with the hand that was not in flannel. "Oddsbud, Oddsheart, you dear rogue, I had forgot. There is young Tom, Yellow Tom, my nephew, you know, lies sick at Harrogate. Why shouldn't he go that day as well as another, and if he does, I get an estate by it. Why, look'ee, I asked Dr. Headstone yesterday if I was like to take a fit any time, and he laughed and swore I was the last man in town to go off that way." The judge sent most of his servants down to Buxton to make his lodgings and all things comfortable for him. He was to follow in a day or two. It was now the 9th, and the next day well over he might laugh at his visions and auguries. On the evening of the 9th, Dr. Headstone's footman knocked at the judge's door. The doctor ran up the dusky stairs to the drawing-room. It was a March evening, near the hour of sunset, with an east wind whistling sharply through the chimney stacks. A wood fire blazed cheerily on the hearth, and Judge Harbottle, in what was then called a brigadier wig, with his red roquelaure on, helped the glowing effect of the darkened chamber, which looked red all over like a room on fire. The judge had his feet on a stool, and his huge grim purple face confronted the fire, and seemed to pant and swell as the blaze alternately spread upward and collapsed. He had fallen again among his blue devils, and was thinking of retiring from the bench, and of 50 other gloomy things. But the doctor, who was an energetic son of Aesculapius, would listen to no croaking, told the judge he was full of gout, and in his present condition no judge even of his own case, but promised him leave to pronounce on all those melancholy questions a fortnight later. In the meantime, the judge must be very careful. He was overcharged with gout, and he must not provoke an attack till the waters of Buxton should do that office for him in their own salutary way. The doctor did not think him perhaps quite so well as he pretended, for he told him he wanted rest, and would be better if he went forthwith to his bed. Mr. Girningham, his valet, assisted him, and gave him his drops, and the judge told him to wait in his bedroom till he should go to sleep. 3 persons that night had specially odd stories to tell. The housekeeper had got rid of the trouble of amusing her little girl at this anxious time by giving her leave to run about the sitting rooms and look at the pictures and china on the usual condition of touching nothing. It was not until the last gleam of sunset had for some time faded, and the twilight had so deepened that she could no longer discern the colours on the china figures on the chimney-piece or in the cabinets, that the child returned to the housekeeper's room to find her mother. To her she related, after some prattle about the china and the pictures, and the judge's 2 grand wigs in the dressing-room of the library, an adventure of an extraordinary kind. In the hall was placed, as was customary in those times, the sedan chair which the master of the house occasionally used, covered with stamped leather and studded with gilt nails, and with its red silk blinds down. In this case, the doors of this old-fashioned conveyance were locked, the windows up, and, as I said, the blinds down, but not so closely that the curious child could not peep underneath one of them and see into the interior. A parting beam from the setting sun, admitted through the window of the back room, shot obliquely through the open door, and lighting on the chair, shone with a dull transparency through the crimson blind. To her surprise, the child saw in the shadow a thin man, dressed in black, seated in it. He had sharp dark features, his nose, she fancied, a little awry, and his brown eyes were looking straight before him. His hand was on his thigh, and he stirred no more than the waxen figure she had seen at Southwark Fair. A child is so often lectured for asking questions, and on the propriety of silence, and the superior wisdom of its elders, that it accepts most things at last in good faith, and the little girl acquiesced respectfully in the occupation of the chair by this mahogany-faced person as being all right and proper. It was not until she asked her mother who this man was, and observed her scared face as she questioned her more minutely upon the appearance of the stranger, that she began to understand that she had seen something unaccountable. Mrs. Carwell took the key of the chair from its nail over the footman's shelf, and led the child by the hand up to the hall, having a lighted candle in her other hand. She stopped at a distance from the chair, and placed the candlestick in the child's hand. "Peep in, Marjorie, again, and try if there's anything there," she whispered. "Hold the candle near the blind so as to throw its light through the curtain." The child peeped this time with a very solemn face, and intimated at once that he was gone. "Look again and be sure," urged her mother. The little girl was quite certain, and Mrs. Carwell, with her mob cap of lace and cherry-coloured ribbons, and her dark brown hair, not yet powdered, over a very pale face, unlocked the door, looked in, and beheld emptiness. "All a mistake, child, you see. There, ma'am, see there, he's gone round the corner," said the child. "Where?" said Mrs. Carwell, stepping backward a step. "Into that room." "Tut, child, 'twas the shadow!" cried Mrs. Carwell angrily, because she was frightened. "I moved the candle!" But she clutched one of the poles of the chair, which leant against the wall in the corner, and pounded the floor furiously with one end of it, being afraid to pass the open door the child had pointed to. The cook and 2 kitchen maids came running upstairs, not knowing what to make of this unwonted alarm. They all searched the room, but it was still and empty, and no sign of anyone's having been there. Some people may suppose that the direction given to her thoughts by this odd little incident will account for a very strange illusion which Mrs. Carwell herself experienced about 2 hours later. Mrs. Flora Carwell was going up the great staircase with a posset for the judge in a china bowl on a little silver tray. Across the top of the well staircase there runs a massive oak rail, and, raising her eyes accidentally, she saw an extremely odd-looking stranger, slim and long, leaning carelessly over with a pipe between his finger and thumb. Nose, lips and chin seemed all to droop downward into extraordinary length as he leant his odd-peering face over the banister. In his other hand he held a coil of rope, one end of which escaped from under his elbow and hung over the rail. Mrs. Carwell, who had no suspicion at the moment that he was not a real person, and fancied that he was someone employed in cording the judge's luggage, called to know what he was doing there. Instead of answering, he turned about and walked across the lobby at about the same leisurely pace at which she was ascending, and entered a room into which she followed him. It was an uncarpeted and unfurnished chamber. An open trunk lay upon the floor empty, and beside it the coil of rope, but except herself being there. Perhaps when she was able to think it over, it was a relief was no one in the room. Mrs. Carwell was very much frightened, and now concluded that the child must have seen the same ghost that had just appeared to believe so, for the face, figure and dress described by the child were awfully like Pinewick, and this certainly was not he. Very much scared and very hysterical, Mrs. Carwell ran down to her room, afraid to look over her shoulder, and got some companions about her, and wept and talked and drank more than one cordial, and talked and wept again, and so on, until, in those early days, it was 10 o'clock, and time to go to bed. A scullery maid remained up finishing some of her scouring and scalding for some time after the other servants, who, as I said, were few in number, that night had got to their beds. This was a low-browed, broad-faced, intrepid wench with black hair, who did not value a ghost not a button, and treated the housekeeper's hysterics with measureless scorn. The old house was quiet now. It was near 12 o'clock. No sounds were audible except the muffled wailing of the wintry winds, piping high among the roofs and chimneys, or rumbling at intervals in under-gusts through the narrow channels of the street. The spacious solitudes of the kitchen level were awfully dark, and this sceptical kitchen wench was the only person now up and about the house. She hummed tunes to herself for a time, and then stopped and listened, and then resumed her work again. At last she was destined to be more terrified than even was the housekeeper. There was a back kitchen in this house, and from this she heard, as if coming from below its foundations, a sound like heavy strokes that seemed to shake the earth beneath her feet. Sometimes a dozen in sequence, at regular intervals, sometimes fewer. She walked out softly into the passage, and was surprised to see a dusky glow issuing from this room, as if from a charcoal fire. The room seemed thick with smoke. Looking in, she very dimly beheld a monstrous figure over a furnace, beating with a mighty hammer the rings and rivets of a chain. The strokes, swift and heavy as they looked, sounded hollow and distant. The man stopped and pointed to something on the floor, that through the smoky haze looked, the thought, like a dead body. She remarked no more, but the servants in the room close by, startled from their sleep by a hideous scream, found her in a swoon on the flags close to the door, where she had just witnessed this ghastly vision. Startled by the girl's incoherent asseverations that she had seen the judge's corpse on the floor, two servants, having first searched the lower part of the house, went rather frightened upstairs to inquire whether their master was well. They found him, not in his bed, but in his room. He had a table with candles burning at his bedside and was getting on his clothes again, and he swore and cursed at them roundly in his old style, telling them that he had business, and that he would discharge on the spot any scoundrel who should dare to disturb him again. So the invalid was left to his quietude. In the morning it was rumoured here and there in the street that the judge was dead. A servant was sent from the house 3 doors away by Councillor Travers to inquire at Judge Harbottle's hall door. The servant who opened it was pale and reserved, and would only say that the judge was ill. He had had a dangerous accident. Dr. Headston had been with him at 7 o'clock in the morning. There were averted looks, short answers, pale and frowning faces, and all the usual signs that there was a secret that sat heavily upon their minds, and the time for disclosing which had not yet come. That time would arrive when the coroner had arrived, and the mortal scandal that had befallen the house could be no longer hidden. for that morning Mr. Justice Harbottle had been found hanging by the neck from the banister at the top of the great staircase, and quite dead. There was not the smallest sign of any struggle or resistance. There had not been heard a cry or any other noise in the slightest degree indicative of violence. There was medical evidence to show that in his atrabilious state it was quite on the cards that he might have made away with himself. The jury found accordingly that it was a case of suicide. But to those who were acquainted with the strange story which Judge Harbottle had related to at least 2 persons, the fact that the catastrophe occurred on the morning of March 10th seemed a startling coincidence. A few days after, the pomp of a great funeral attended him to the grave, and so, in the language of Scripture, the rich man died and was buried. The end.